Steve, a lot of focus, particularly from Wall Street right now, on those comments around perceived flexibility in the balance sheet.
You're exactly right, Morgan. And there was, in my opinion, a change in policy from the Federal Reserve when it came to the balance sheet. So what I've done here is I pulled what was from the Fed's own strategy document in June 2017, where it said under what conditions it would change the balance sheet. And I'll read that specifically to you, and then I'll get to Powell's remarks that I think represent a change. So the committee said back in 2017 it would change the balance sheet if there was a material deterioration in the economic outlook were to warrant a sizable reduction in the committee's target for the federal funds rate. So let me come back and explain that if that's a little hard to explain. In other words, they would first reduce the funds rate before, and some people thought that meant to zero, before they changed the balance sheet. Now, here's the verbatim of what Chairman Jay Powell said. He said, if we came to the view that the balance sheet normalization or any other aspect of normalization was part of the problem, we wouldn't hesitate to make a change. So to me, that says the balance sheet as part of the whole thing about flexibility that you mentioned, Morgan, right at the top. It's on the table now if they do come to the conclusion that the balance sheet is upsetting markets, tightening further than we thought. I don't know, by the way, if Powell has his full committee with him on it. That's something we're going to kind of figure out. I think the committee may be inclined more towards flexibility than the original June statement. But I think the market picked up, I think, correctly on the significance of a change in policy on the balance sheet here.
Steve, it's David. Contrast it for me with the statements from the December press conference as well. Is that when we got autopilot? And is that obviously different than what we're hearing now?
That's when we got autopilot. Now, let me back up just a little bit from maybe a little bit of being too excited about this change. Remember, Powell's also said just before that other part, he doesn't see the balance sheet as a problem. He doesn't think it's the problem the market has laid it out to be. And very much Powell and other members of the Fed want the balance sheet to be reduced on autopilot. And the reason Powell explained in the discussion there is they don't want to have two variables moving at once. They want to have one variable stagnant, which is the planned reduction of the balance sheet, while they're changing rates as needed. And Mester kind of backed up that desire on the part of the committee here. But the idea that it's on the table, if it's perceived to be a problem, what that actual criteria is, I don't know. But, yeah, that is a walk back, I would say, David, from the December comment of autopilot.
And, Steve, to my eye, the major indices first began perking up when the Fed chair said, with muted inflation readings, we will be patient. I think the Dow picked up about 150 points. It was already up about 1.7%, moved above 2% after he said that. And then he went on to talk about keeping the expansion on track. Overall, just with all of these comments, seeming to perhaps walk back at least the way markets took some of the previous comments, what should we take away from what we've just heard?
I think the metaphor here is the pilots are back in control of the airplane. I think there was a perception in the market, and I don't think the market was wrong to perceive this, that there were two aspects of Fed policy on autopilot here. The first was rates. The idea that was probably throughout the market earlier in the fall and later as the winter began was that the Fed was inexorably headed towards this mid-range of the neutral rate regardless of what happened. It was a sense of autopilot on rates, and of course we just discussed a sense of autopilot on the balance sheet. So, when Morgan picked out the word flexibility at the beginning, I think that's what the market wanted to hear. And the idea that he sees muted inflation, John, you're right. In other words, there's no force on the Fed to move rates. If inflation was moving up, if it had been tick, tick, tick like this, but the idea that inflation is even a little bit below or at its range of 2% gives the chairman flexibility and the committee flexibility to not hike rates quite so automatically as the market had perceived earlier this year, or late last year, I guess.
Steve, one of the other things that really jumped out at me was the back and forth and what sort of culminated in a one-word answer around the independence of the Fed and how to think about that, given the much more politicized nature, at least, I guess, within media and social media, Twitter, with the president making his thoughts on Fed policy known.
Yeah, I think without actually directly mentioning President Trump, I think Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen both suggested that it was better, it worked better the other way. The idea that there wasn't a president who was tweeting or otherwise commenting on Fed policy, that creates better Fed independence. And I also want to point out, Morgan, I was glad that Neil Irwin, a colleague of mine, asked this question about employment and the Fed, because I think it's well forgotten. Some members of this on our air as well, that the Fed did more earlier in the financial crisis for jobs and employment than anybody else. Congress was not acting after the original stimulus thing. So I think it's important to point out that, people say the Fed wants unemployment. I don't think that's true, and I don't think its record ever really backed up that idea.